our next talk is from Amparo, Domingo and Linda Hart. They are on the legal committee of WDI, Women's Declaration International, and have been working along with some other lawyers or experts on international law and politics to see what's happening at the UN and in international human rights circles, etc. And they, along with others on the legal committee, have come up with WDI's response to a report on gender theory by i.e. SOGI, Madrigal, Borloz, but I'll hand over to you so you can explain what it is. So Amparo Domingo is also the country contact for Spain for WDI and host of this webinar often. And Linda Hart is from Finland and on the laws committee. So over to you two.
Today, we're talking to you about WDI's response to report on gender theory by independent expert on sexual orientation and gender identity, Madrigal Borloz. The main point of the response is to fight back on attempts to define sex as gender in the UN. But let's get into some more detail. Last May, Women's Declaration International called on the United Nations Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights to protect women and girls globally on the basis of sex by refraining from approving the report on gender theory by Madrigal Borloz, independent expert for protection against violence and discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity at the United Nations. We argue that the independent expert must give space and consideration to women's concerns and the potential erosion of women's rights. In his report, which came out last summer, he has done the opposite. The first and second parts of the report submitted to the United Nations Human Rights Council in June and July 2021 are called The Law of Inclusion and Practices of Exclusion. Part 1 of the report presents incorporating gender identity in legislation as purely positive and legitimate, whereas Part 2 of his report presents any defense of sex-based rights as negative and exclusionary. To us, it seems that the report seems to be designed to advance the incorporation of the nebulous and shifting concept of gender identity within international law without proper scrutiny and critical examination. We believe this is done in a manner that violates the fundamental human rights of women and girls as a female sex class. In much of what is written in the 3 different documents that can be accessed, Part 1, Part 2, and then also a kind of an easy to read summary. The independent expert tends to contradict himself, claiming that gender as a concept that has evolved in his report from a social construct to an identity, and finally to what he calls a suprabiological phenomenon, whatever that might mean, will not curtail any achievements in equality between the sexes, while at the same time reifying immaterial gender identity as more important than physical sex, for example, in sports. And he does this expressly. The zeal in presenting the reification of gender identities in different societies as a very positive development takes him as far as to state that the categories of male and female are a consequence of colonialism. Quote, to quote his report, the evidence suggests that in many countries, the rigid understanding of the binary of male and female as a main ordering social principle are the result of colonialism. The idea, we argue that, and write in our statement, that the idea that only the Western world observes the sex binary is, in short, quite patronizing and insulting. I must add that the WDI statement was a joint collaborative text of 4 women to get all together from the legal committee, but it's just the 2 of us who are presenting it, not to take full credit of everything. The independent expert himself even contradicts his own assertions. Throughout, he considers gender as socially constructed under many different formulations, but also innate as an identity or an inner feeling. We argue that it is unacceptable that a report that in its very premise makes directly contradictory claims is taken seriously.
I'm going to talk a little about how this report came to be. And it's in February 2021, the independent expert issued a call for input to a thematic report that had as a title, Gender, Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. Its stated purpose was to inform the independent experts report to be presented to the 47th session to the Human Rights Council. So this was a report to present before the UN as in an official manner. So throughout the process, there has been lack of transparency and smearing of feminists. Regarding transparency, the call in February said that all responses and submission received in accessible format would be published online, except if confidentially of the submission is explicitly requested, as you can see in the slide. But then when the report arrived, as you see, some of them were excluded. We're aware of at least 3 submissions that were both timely and submitted using the required accessible PDF format. These submissions were made by WDI itself. At the time, we were called with our former name, Women's Human Rights Campaign, and also by 2 signatories of the declaration, Jan Rivers and Anna Kerr of the Feminist Legal Clinic in Australia. Correspondence from Rivers and Kerr is available in the footnotes of the WDI statement, which is available on the WDI website. As you see in the screen, on screen, he said that a comparatively small number of submissions were hateful, so they're going to be excluded without giving any chance to fight this definition of being hateful. As I was telling you, we were aware of these submissions that, of course, were not hateful and have not been publicized. And the thing is that the Office for the High Commissioner for Human Rights offers instructions about good governance, making a mention of transparent and accountable processes and institutions. Furthermore, the Human Rights Council offers attributes of good governance as transparency, responsibility, accountability, participation, and responsiveness to the needs of the people. So we call on the Office of the High Commissioner to live up to these ideals it espouses and to publish the submissions made by, to a great extent, grassroots women's organizations to the independent experts and to explain what in the submissions is regarded as hateful or hate speech. The use of hyperbolic language is nothing short of astonishing during the report. Submissions from feminists describing the harms that gender identity ideology creates for women and girls were placed. That was called Practices of Exclusion, which, according to Madrigal Borloz, that report had as a goal to analyze backlash against the incorporation of gender frameworks. So the defense of women's sex-based rights is a backlash against the gender frameworks. So, as I said, it includes feminist positions. Sheila Jeffries was mentioned. And harms to women and girls' rights were described patronizingly as alleged. In sum, we argue that with this report, the independent expert seeks to assert a new meaning for gender in direct conflict with how it has been used and understood before. This is done by stepping away from its conventional meaning of social roles and expectations assigned to both sexes to an integral part of individual identity, that would be the gender identity that I talk about, or personality, which they explain as gender expression. He also does not acknowledge the resulting confusion of this to the meaning of gender in international and human rights law. By colonizing this key word in this manner, all existing legislation that seeks to prevent discrimination on the basis of gender, understood so far in history as combating the hierarchy, privileging men over women in the distribution of wealth and power, now would invert the scope of such legislation. Nowadays, in some jurisdictions, not complying with the demands and wishes of those who claim to have a gender identity, that not complying is considered legally sanctioned discrimination. We conclude our statement sent to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights of the United Nations that protection of gender or gender identity in place of, in addition to, or as a component of sex contravenes the principles reaffirmed in the Declaration of Women's Sex-Based Rights, violates the sex-based rights of women and girls globally, and must be rejected.
In short, I'm a sociologist, researcher, and have studied international law quite a bit, but not very recently. So after a few years of studying and researching rather different topics, I was horrified to find out that things had gotten so crazy in many ways, because back in the 2000s, the noughties, when the first set of Yogyakarta principles were formulated into a document, if one adopts a charitable interpretation, it's like, okay, because sexual orientation and so-called gender identity had not really been on the global UN agenda at all. And even just talking about the human rights of being protected from violence, etc., on the basis of these attributes, it was quite a job to get even the basic stuff on the global UN agenda. But in recent years, things have proceeded very, very quickly. Amparo will offer some further commentary on the Yogyakarta principles and Madrigal Borloz. But what really stood out in Madrigal Borloz's report from last year, Report on Gender Theory, even the title is a bit absurd from a kind of a so-called women's studies or gender studies point of view. What gender theory? Usually the critique from the other side, our opponents, is that there's not one actual thing called gender theory. What on earth do you mean? But in the report, what stands out that really rather concrete empirical issues are brushed over. So women's sports, like Amparo mentioned, harms caused to women and girls, for example, in the field of sports is more like the text of report reads that, it is just a prejudice and alleged harms, and a sign that these feminists, whoever, think that, quote, trans girls are not girls, and something like that. So personally, from a kind of professional perspective, it's like, how on earth has the argumentation gone so low that it is not of better quality, so to say? And not in the actual reports, but in the summary. For some reason, there's a little point about puberty blockers as well. The actual reference given in relation to puberty blocking treatment, which is dealt with in a positive manner, is Turban et al. 2020, which is well known to be one academic article, a low quality study, because it is based on data which is non-representative and not from a clinical environment, and an internet survey. And the independent expert doesn't give any kind of an inkling for the general public or the readers that it is not one study that could prove anything. It is more like a body of evidence, several scientific studies that then can point some way. But if we want to think of positive developments, at least in the questions of women's sport and puberty blockers, we have actually come quite a long way during 1 year, because now sports organizations have been giving new guidelines, for example, in the field of swimming and rugby. And as we all, if not all, many of us know, the Tavistock gender Identity Development Service clinic for children and adolescents in England, the Tavistock clinic for children closing is a major development in this area and proves the independent expert quite wrong. But it's still quite, let's adopt the word, astonishing once again to see how low quality the argumentation is in this important arena.
We are going full circle with linking our presentation with María Yaoyólotl presentation, because the Jakarta principles that are mentioned in the first part of the report as a relevant and prominent international human rights document, which we know they are not, as I said, they are mentioned without any disclaimer about the relation of the expert to them. Víctor Madrigal Borloz, incumbent independent expert in sexual orientation and gender identity for the UN, is a signatory of Yogyakarta Principles Plus 10, which is the enhancement of the original Yogyakarta Principles that were added in 2017. Not only he omits that information in his report, but he goes further because he makes a false claim saying that it was in 2018 when he, and this is a quote, I quote now, he concluded that the right to self-determine one's gender was a fundamental part of a person's freedom and a cornerstone of the person's identity, unquote. So he says that as it was his conclusion in 2018, as if that hadn't been his belief already when he was appointed to this UN position only 5 days after Yogyakarta Plus 10 were published. You can see the tweet where he launches the addition to Yogyakarta Principles, November 27th, 2017. He's so proud to have been a part of this extraordinary, by all measures, document. And then he was appointed December 4th, 2017 for this position at the UN. So that's how, though they have not been approved and incorporated into international instruments of human rights, but they are being pushed very hard, very aggressively by people working inside the UN as the SOGI expert, so to say, Madrigal Borloz, who last week had an official visit to the US, pretending that so-called trans rights were in danger in the US because feminists, bad, wicked feminists were preventing some legislation to pass. And he was mentioning, of course, all the bills that and laws that have been passed to protect, for instance, women's sports in different states in the United States. So that was last week. He goes on with his support of self-identification, which is so staunch that he considers the requirements of, and now I'm quoting again, medical certification, surgery or treatment. He says that these are abusive or even, and this is another quote, cruel, inhuman and degrading treatment and possibly torture. So medical certification is torture for Madrigal Borloz. And this is in an official report that is written by this expert for the UN with all the seals and logos, and it says uploaded at the official website of the UN. It's now an official document. And nevertheless, it's very curious to find out that in the same paragraph, he contradicts himself by stating that, another quote, access to transition-related medical care is part of the measures ensuring bodily autonomy for trans persons. So first is a torture, and then it's a human right. So we leave it at this point, but I encourage anyone interested in the subject to follow this person and his office and all the material he's producing, because he's creating a lot of reports and information that later on have a direct influence on what the governments are doing from the national point of view. And some months ago, he, in a recorded intervention, he encouraged every government on earth to have self-ID before 2030, you know, the Agenda 2030. So he made that appeal to every government, every state on earth to have self-ID before 2030.
Please do get to know our statement from the WDI website, and if interested, do have a read of the report on gender theory. If anyone would be interested in joining WDI teams working on international law or organizations of states such as the United Nations, the European Union, or the Council of Europe, please contact. We added the basic email address. Hopefully then the campaign can forward your emails to us. We have the legal committee, and there's a new budding kind of an EU team, but that could be then broadly incorporating other European organizations such as the Council of Europe as well. And thinking back to what Amparo was talking about in her comment, knowledge and expertise on international law and politics is appreciated, but also we might be interested in hearing from women in healthcare professions. So could be medical doctors or nurses or physiotherapists or anyone with specific knowledge and motivation coming together. Please let us know. And what new volunteers could do is really, it can be a one-off thing, digging out some information, perhaps from a particular country or in a particular theme, perhaps giving one talk in the webinar, but you can also remain anonymous and in the background if you want. So it really can be tailored for your needs. Thank you very much.